Dearest listeners, they say a woman's virtue, once lost, can never be reclaimed. But what if I told you of a lady's maid who lay with a dying officer, bore his bastard child, and yet became the most honored wife in 3 counties? Today, your humble chronicler brings you the most scandalous tale of redemption ever whispered in the drawing rooms of England. A story where death revealed a scoundrel's lies and a wounded soldier's mercy proved stronger than society's cruelest judgments. But let us not rush, for the best stories, like the finest brandy, must be savored with careful attention to every sip. Before we begin this journey into the heart of honor and disgrace, perhaps you might favor this author with a gesture of your regard, a small token of approval beneath this tale, or better still, pledge your continued patronage by subscribing to these chronicles. And should the story move you, I do so hope you shall share your thoughts in the remarks below, for what good is a tale if not discussed amongst kindred spirits? Now, settle yourselves comfortably, for we journey back to the spring of 1813, when Napoleon's shadow still darkened Europe, and in the green hills of Gloucestershire, a young woman's world was about to shatter in ways she could never have foreseen. The manor of Thornbridge sat like a jeweled crown upon the rolling countryside of Gloucestershire, its honey-colored stone glowing warm even on the greyest of days. Here, Miss Rosalind Thatcher had spent the past 4 years of her 22 years serving as lady's maid to Viscountess Harrington, and here she had learned the art of invisibility, to glide along walls rather than cross the center of a room, to anticipate the need for a shawl before the air grew chill, and to keep her footsteps so silent upon the floorboards that her presence was often felt as a breeze rather than a person. One must confess that Rosalind possessed a peculiar sort of beauty, not the bold, attention-demanding sort that launched young ladies into ballrooms with mothers trailing hopefully behind, but rather the quiet, devastating kind that crept upon a gentleman unawares. Her hair, a shade of auburn that captured firelight with alarming ease, she kept severely pinned beneath her cap. Her eyes, gray as a winter dawn, she trained perpetually downward in the manner befitting her station. Her figure, which even the drab stuff of a servant's dress could not entirely disguise, she carried with such studied modesty that it often took a second glance to perceive its true elegance. She had come to Thornbridge after her father's death, a country curate who had educated his daughter far beyond her prospects, filling her head with Shakespeare and poetry when he ought to have taught her needlework and resignation. Her mother had died bringing her into the world, a fact that the village gossips had deemed appropriately tragic for the daughter of so impractical a man. With no dowry, no connections, and learning that served only to make her unfit for factory work, Rosalind had grasped at the position of lady's maid as a drowning woman might grasp at driftwood. Viscountess Harrington, born Lady Eugenia Fairholme and possessed of more kindness than many of her station thought quite proper, had taken pity on the curate's orphan. The Viscountess valued intelligence in her servants. She found it so much more efficient than training dullards, and Rosalind had proven herself worth every penny of her £18 per annum. The hierarchy of Thornbridge's servants' hall was as rigid as the social structure that governed the world above stairs. Mrs. Drummond, the housekeeper, ruled the female staff with an iron fist encased in black bombazine. She was a widow of uncertain years, with a face like weathered granite and eyes that missed precisely nothing. From the first, she had harbored a particular suspicion of Rosalind, though whether this stemmed from the girl's education, her appearance, or merely a general distrust of pretty servants, none could say. Mrs. Drummond was fond of declaring that a bonny face in service was naught but trouble waiting to happen, that the moment a gentleman took notice, it mattered not how respectable the lass thought herself. Rosalind had taken these warnings to heart, cultivating an attitude of such profound propriety that even Mrs. Drummond could find little fault. She rose at 5, attended the Viscountess from morning ablutions through evening toilette, mended, pressed, arranged, and disappeared into her small room beneath the eaves each night with the same quiet efficiency. She did not encourage the footman's attentions. She did not gossip overmuch with the housemaids. She read her father's worn copy of Milton by candlelight and dreamed impossible dreams she shared with no one. At 22, she understood her prospects with the clarity of someone who has spent years observing the world from the shadows. She would never marry a gentleman. Her birth was too low, and her virtue, paradoxically, too assured for a man seeking a mistress. She might, if fortune smiled, attract a respectable tradesman, or perhaps a head footman from another household. More likely, she would remain a lady's maid until age or circumstance rendered her unfit for service, at which point she would face the almshouse or starvation. It was not a cheerful contemplation, but Rosalind had learned early that reality rarely accommodated itself to one's wishes. She had her books, her small comforts, and the reflected glory of living in a great house. Many women endured far worse. The spring of 1813 arrived at Thornbridge with its customary profusion of daffodils and cherry blossoms. And with it came word that quite altered the peaceful routine of the household. Lord Harrington, who spent most of his time in London attending to his seat in Parliament, sent notice that he would be arriving within the week, and furthermore, that he would be bringing guests, military men, officers returned from the peninsula, one gravely wounded and requiring country air for his recovery. The household erupted into controlled chaos. Mrs. Drummond marshaled her troops with military precision. Every room must be aired, every surface polished until it gleamed, every guest chamber prepared to exacting standards. The Viscountess, normally serene, fretted over arrangements with unusual agitation. She confided to Rosalind that one of the guests was Lieutenant Henry Beauchamp, second son of the Earl of Wrexham, and warned her maid to be especially circumspect in her conduct. These men had seen horrors beyond imagining, she explained. They might be changed, haunted, altered in fundamental ways that made them unpredictable. The Viscountess reasoned that Rosalind's composed nature and refined education might prove a soothing balm to a soldier's troubled soul, a more calming influence than that of a coarser servant. It was a miscalculation born of kindness, one she would come to regret most bitterly. Rosalind had no intention of being anything but invisible, as always. Great ladies and gentlemen came and went at houses like Thornbridge. What were they to her, save additional work? She could not have known, as she bent over her careful stitches in the warm afternoon light of the servants' hall that Wednesday in late April, that her life was about to fracture into before and after, that within a fortnight she would learn exactly how much a woman could lose and how unexpectedly salvation might arrive from the most unlikely source. The guests arrived when the light slanted golden through the ancient oaks lining the drive. Rosalind, engaged in mending one of the Viscountess's morning dresses, heard the commotion of arrival, the crunch of gravel, the calling of footmen, the general flutter that attended any disruption of routine. She thought nothing of it. The first indication that something unusual had occurred came when Mrs. Drummond descended to the servants' hall with her face set in grim lines, summoning Rosalind above stairs immediately. To be called thus was rarely a good sign. The Viscountess required her assistance in the blue guest chamber. One of the officers had taken ill during the journey, and Rosalind was to help attend him until the physician arrived from the village. Mrs. Drummond's eyes narrowed as she delivered her instructions. Rosalind was to remember herself, to be respectful, silent, and above all, proper. These were gentlemen of quality, injured in service to the crown. Rosalind followed the housekeeper up the back stairs, through the green baize door that separated the servants' domain from the grandeur beyond, and into the main body of the house. The blue guest chamber was situated in the east wing, its windows overlooking the rose garden. As they approached, voices could be heard, the Viscountess's calm tones, a man's deeper rumble, and another voice, younger, speaking in evident distress. Mrs. Drummond knocked once and opened the door, pushing Rosalind forward with a firm hand at her back. The scene that met Rosalind's eyes would remain burned into her memory for the remainder of her days. Every detail preserved with the peculiar clarity that attends life's pivotal moments. The blue chamber earned its name from the silk wall coverings imported from France before the war. A a shade somewhere between heaven and sapphire. Upon the great four-poster bed, propped against a mountain of pillows, lay a young man of perhaps 26 years. His face, even pale with pain and fever, possessed a classical beauty that might have graced a Greek statue, all clean lines and elegant proportions. Dark hair, damp with sweat, fell across his brow. His eyes, when they opened, were the deep brown of polished walnut. He wore his shirt sleeves rolled back, and white bandaging wrapped his left shoulder and upper arm, a bloom of red seeping through where the wound wept still. Standing near the window, watching the scene with an expression difficult to decipher, was another officer. This man was older, perhaps 30 years, and whilst he stood upright, there was something in the careful way he held himself that suggested his own injuries, though less visible than his companions'. His hair was a dark blonde, shot through with premature gray at the temples. His face bore the weathering of campaign and the lines of pain long endured. A scar ran from his left eyebrow into his hairline, pale against his sun-darkened skin. But it was his eyes that arrested attention. A pale gray blue that seemed to see far too much, like winter light reflecting off a frozen lake. Those eyes fixed on Rosalind for one brief, assessing moment before returning to his injured friend. The Viscountess explained that Lieutenant Beauchamp had reopened his wound during the journey, and they must keep the fever down until Dr. Morrison arrived. She handed Rosalind a cloth and instructed her to bathe the lieutenant's face and throat gently, then departed to instruct cook to prepare a tisane. Thus Rosalind found herself alone with the two officers, her hands trembling slightly as she approached the bed. This was highly irregular, a female servant, unchaperoned with two gentlemen. But the Viscountess's word was law within these walls, and clearly the lieutenant's comfort took precedence over strict propriety. She had tended the sick before. During her father's final illness, she had learned to be gentle, yet efficient. She approached the bed with the same composure she had cultivated through years of service, wrung out the cloth, and with eyes modestly lowered, began to bathe the lieutenant's fevered brow. His skin burned beneath her touch. She worked with quiet efficiency, cooling his face, his throat, his wrists where the pulse hammered too fast. The lieutenant murmured in his delirium, calling her an angel, remarking upon her beauty with the uninhibited frankness of fever. His hand, burning hot, caught her wrist, and he begged to know her name. When she whispered it, Rosalind, he pronounced it like a prayer, and immediately drew the connection to Shakespeare's clever heroine. Despite herself, despite the impropriety, despite the warning voice in her head that sounded remarkably like Mrs. Drummond, Rosalind felt something shift in her chest. A gentleman who knew his Shakespeare? Who drew the connection immediately. Her father had been fond of the bard, she admitted quietly, and the lieutenant declared him a man of excellent taste. He extracted a promise that she would not abandon him to his fever, his grip on her wrist loosening into something almost like a caress. The older officer, Captain Sebastian Wycliffe, as she would later learn, suggested she wait outside, his voice carrying a distinct edge of disapproval. But before Rosalind could move, the Viscountess returned with a maid bearing tisane and fresh water. What followed were 3 hours of careful nursing, during which Henry's fever broke at last, leaving him exhausted but lucid. Throughout it all, Rosalind was acutely aware of Sebastian's watchful presence, the way his eyes followed her movements, assessing, judging, finding something that troubled him deeply. When at last Dr. Morrison arrived and declared the lieutenant out of immediate danger, Rosalind was dismissed back to her duties. She descended the back stairs on trembling legs, knowing with the terrible certainty of instinct that something irrevocable had begun. Mrs. Drummond was waiting in the corridor outside the servants' hall, arms crossed, face grim. Already he had noticed Rosalind, she observed flatly. Already the girl had been alone with him. Rosalind protested that she had simply been doing as she was bid, but Mrs. Drummond was unmoved. No good came of a pretty servant catching a gentleman's eye, no matter how innocent it began. Rosalind was to keep her distance from Lieutenant Beauchamp. The girl agreed, but even as she spoke the words, she knew they were likely already lies. That night, as she lay in her narrow bed beneath the eaves, she could not stop thinking of fever-bright eyes and a voice that quoted Shakespeare as easily as breathing. And in the blue guest chamber, Sebastian Wycliffe stood at the window, watching moonlight silver the gardens, and felt the first stirrings of a dread he could not name, a presentiment that his dearest friend was about to make a terrible mistake, and that the young woman with the gray eyes and auburn hair would pay the price for it. Lieutenant Henry Beauchamp recovered with the resilience common to young men who have survived battlefield wounds. Within 3 days, the fever had vanished entirely, leaving him weak but determined to be up and about. Dr. Morrison prescribed gentle exercise, good food, and most emphatically, no excitement whatsoever. The lieutenant appeared to find this last restriction particularly irksome. Captain Sebastian Wycliffe assisted his friend in navigating the stairs down to the drawing room for the first time since his collapse, exercising the patience that had served him well through 3 years of bloody Peninsula campaign. Henry complained that he had not survived Badajoz to be coddled like an infant, but Sebastian remained unmoved. Fortune had allowed Henry to survive thus far. Patience would ensure his continued survival through peacetime, though patience had never numbered among Henry's virtues. Henry laughed, though the sound lacked its former brightness. The war had marked him in ways both visible and not. The shoulder wound that had forced his return to England was merely the most recent in a catalogue of injuries sustained during brutal fighting. But more than that, something in his eyes had changed. Where once there had been uncomplicated joy in life's pleasures, now there lurked shadows that no amount of English sunshine could quite dispel. The war had marked Sebastian too, though in different ways. His injuries were mostly healed. The leg that had been crushed beneath his dying horse at Salamanca now functioned adequately, if not perfectly. The scar that bisected his eyebrow troubled him not at all. But the nightmares, the bone-deep exhaustion, the sense that he had left something vital on those blood-soaked fields, these things pursued him with relentless determination. He had loved soldiering once. Now he endured it, and endured the peace that followed with equal resignation. What he could not endure was watching his closest friend spiral toward self-destruction, for it became immediately apparent in those first days of recovery that Lieutenant Henry Beauchamp had developed an obsession with the Viscountess's lady's maid. It began innocently enough. Henry required assistance with matters his injured shoulder made difficult, changing his dressing, managing his clothing, the 1,000 small indignities of convalescence. The Viscountess, ever practical, assigned Rosalind to assist him, reasoning that the girl had proven herself capable during his fever, and that propriety could be maintained so long as the door remained open and Sebastian was present. Mrs. Drummond protested this arrangement with unusual vehemence, but the Viscountess overruled her. The lieutenant was a guest, a wounded hero, and entitled to every comfort Thornbridge could provide. Thus Rosalind found herself attending Henry each morning, changing his bandages with gentle efficiency, whilst he gazed at her with an intensity that made her hands tremble. He spoke to her as he had during his fever, quoting poetry, drawing literary references, treating her not as a servant, but as an intellectual equal. He asked about her father, her education, her thoughts on Shakespeare and Milton. He seemed genuinely interested in her opinions, a novelty so intoxicating that Rosalind found her carefully cultivated reserve crumbling like sand before the tide. Sebastian observed these interactions with growing alarm. He recognized the signs, had seen them before in his friend, this capacity to fixate utterly upon an unsuitable object. Henry possessed that peculiar aristocratic charm that could make a woman feel as though she were the only creature in existence, the sole focus of his considerable attention. It was a gift that had served him well amongst the camp followers and officers' wives of the peninsula, but turned upon an innocent lady's maid, it became a weapon of terrible potency. Sebastian attempted to intervene. He suggested to Lord Harrington that perhaps Henry's bandages might be managed by a male servant. He reminded his friend that Rosalind was a respectable young woman whose reputation could be damaged by excessive familiarity. He even, in a moment of desperation, hinted that Henry's attentions might be unwelcome. Henry dismissed all concerns with the blithe confidence of a man who has never seriously considered consequences. Rosalind was different, he insisted. She was educated, refined, trapped in service by cruel circumstance rather than nature. He meant her no dishonor. He simply enjoyed her company, her conversation, the gentle competence with which she attended him. Surely Sebastian, of all people, could understand the comfort of intelligent companionship after years of military brutality. Sebastian could understand. That was precisely the problem. He understood too well how a wounded soldier might mistake gratitude and loneliness for love, how a young woman might confuse a gentleman's temporary attention with genuine regard. He had seen it happen before, though never with stakes quite so high. He said nothing more. What could he say, after all, that would not sound like jealousy or moralizing? Henry was his superior officer, his dearest friend, a man who had saved his life at Ciudad Rodrigo. Who was Sebastian to dictate his conduct? And so the dance continued, and Rosalind, poor, foolish Rosalind, fell deeper under Henry's spell with each passing day. The Viscountess, occupied with her own concerns, noticed less than she ought. Lord Harrington, caring only that his guests were comfortable, noticed nothing at all. The other servants whispered amongst themselves, but none dared speak directly of what they observed. Only Mrs. Drummond watched with grim satisfaction, as though witnessing the inevitable confirmation of her darkest prophecies. Henry began taking his exercise in the gardens, always at times when Rosalind might be found there gathering herbs for the still room or taking the air during her brief moments of freedom. These encounters, ostensibly accidental, occurred with such regularity that even the most charitable observer could not mistake their design. They walked together along the gravel paths, maintaining a deliberate distance that fooled precisely no one. Henry spoke of his childhood, his family, the weight of being a second son with all of an eldest's expectations but none of his resources. He confessed his terror during battle, his guilt over comrades lost, his uncertainty about his future now that war had rendered him unfit for further service. He revealed vulnerabilities he had never shown his fellow officers, creating an intimacy more dangerous than any physical touch. Rosalind listened with the whole attention of someone starved for meaningful connection. She had spent 4 years as a piece of furniture, barely acknowledged beyond her function. Now here was a gentleman, handsome, educated, kind, who treated her as though her thoughts mattered, as though she possessed value beyond her ability to arrange hair and press gowns. How could she not respond? How could she not begin to believe that perhaps, impossibly, he might truly care for her? She knew better, of course. Some part of her recognized the folly, understood that gentlemen did not marry ladies' maids no matter how many pretty words they spoke. But Henry had a gift for making the impossible seem merely improbable, for suggesting without quite promising that if only circumstances were different, if only society were more just, if only. 3 weeks after his arrival, Henry kissed her. It happened in the rose garden at twilight, when the air hung heavy with perfume and the last light gilded everything gold. They had been discussing much ado about nothing, and Henry had taken her hand to emphasize some point about Beatrice and Benedict. Then he had simply leaned forward, slowly enough that she might have pulled away, and pressed his lips to hers with a tenderness that stopped her breath. For one perfect, terrible moment, Rosalind forgot everything, her station, her reputation, the impossibility of it all. She felt only the warmth of his mouth, the gentle pressure of his hand at her waist, the way her heart seemed to expand until it might burst from her chest. Then reality crashed back. She pulled away, horrified, stammering apologies, though she knew not for what. Henry caught her hands, begged her not to flee, swore he meant no dishonor. He spoke rapidly, ardently, of his feelings, his intentions, his determination to find a way for them despite the obstacles society imposed. He did not speak of marriage, not quite, but he implied it with sufficient skill that Rosalind heard the promise anyway, heard what she desperately wanted to believe. From the library window, Sebastian watched the scene unfold with a sick feeling in his gut. He had known this moment would come, had dreaded it, but had been powerless to prevent it. Now he could only wait and watch as his friend continued down a path that could only end in ruin for at least one of them, and most likely, both. The astute observer would note that Sebastian had his own reasons for concern beyond simple friendship. For 3 weeks he had watched Rosalind Thatcher move through Thornbridge with quiet grace, had observed her gentleness with Henry, her intelligence in conversation, her desperate hunger for something more than her circumscribed existence offered. He had recognized in her a kindred spirit, not merely in her intelligence, but in the way she wielded books as armor against a world that undervalued her, a mirror of his own youth as a dismissed second son. Someone who lived in the shadows of the quality, capable of so much more than their station allowed. And he had begun, despite his better judgment, to care for her far more than was wise or proper. But Sebastian was not Henry. He did not possess his friend's charm, his ease with women, his casual assumption that what he desired should naturally be his. Sebastian had learned through hard experience that men like him, scarred, taciturn, burdened with a courtesy title that made him neither fish nor fowl, must content themselves with what fortune granted and ask for nothing more. So he remained at his window, watching the tragedy unfold, and said nothing at all. The following weeks passed in a dreamlike haze for Rosalind. Henry courted her with the determination of a general planning a campaign. They met secretly in the garden, in the library when others were at dinner, in the conservatory where the exotic plants provided convenient concealment. He brought her books from Lord Harrington's extensive collection, discussed them with her as though her opinions held weight. He sketched her portrait, badly but with such earnest concentration that she found it charming. He wove a fantasy of a future in which birth and circumstance mattered less than genuine feeling. And Rosalind, who ought to have known better, who had been warned repeatedly by Mrs. Drummond and cautioned by the Viscountess, who could see Sebastian's troubled gaze tracking her movements, Rosalind allowed herself to believe. Perhaps this was why such tales always end in tears, because hope, once kindled in a desperate heart, burns with such fierce brightness that it blinds one to obvious dangers. By the time summer arrived in earnest, Rosalind was wholly, desperately in love with a man who could never marry her, and Henry Beauchamp had begun to speak seriously of the future, though what precisely he meant by such talk remained conveniently vague. Sebastian made one last attempt at intervention. He approached Henry in the library one afternoon when Rosalind was occupied elsewhere, and spoke with unusual directness about honor, consequences, and the harm that might befall an innocent woman. Henry listened with apparent patience, then dismissed his concerns with a wave of his hand. Sebastian did not understand, he said. Rosalind was not some casual diversion. His feelings were genuine, his intentions honorable. He simply needed time to resolve certain family matters before making formal declarations. What family matters? Sebastian pressed. What precisely did Henry intend? But Henry only smiled his most charming smile and suggested Sebastian was worrying overmuch. Everything would work out splendidly. It always did for men of their class. Sebastian wanted to shake him, to force him to confront reality, to make him understand that his actions were not occurring in some romantic fantasy, but in a real world where real people would suffer real consequences. But he remained silent. Because what right had he to interfere? What right had he to imagine that his own feelings, carefully suppressed, never acknowledged, gave him any standing to object? None whatsoever. And so summer deepened, and with it deepened the impossible love between a gentleman who refused to consider consequences and a lady's maid who had forgotten to guard her heart. Fortune, it seemed, was preparing to demand its reckoning. The question was not whether disaster would strike, but when and how terrible the cost would prove when it did. June arrived at Thornbridge with the full glory of an English summer, roses blooming in profusion, larks singing in the morning air, and the days stretching long and golden toward twilight. It was a season for happiness, for garden parties and gentle walks, for love declared beneath starlit skies. For Rosalind Thatcher, it was the season she lost herself entirely. One must confess that the girl had fought valiantly against her growing attachment to Lieutenant Beauchamp. Each night, as she lay in her narrow bed beneath the eaves, she catalogued all the reasons why she must end this dangerous connection. He was a gentleman, she a servant. His family would never countenance such a match. His attentions, however sincere they seemed, could not possibly lead to anything but her ruin. She told herself these truths with the desperate earnestness of someone trying to convince themselves of an unpalatable fact. And each morning, when she encountered Henry in the garden, or the library, or the conservatory, her resolve crumbled like ancient parchment. He was simply too attentive, too charming, too seemingly sincere in his regard. He spoke of her education with admiration, quoted poetry with her father's same passion, treated her opinions as though they mattered. More than that, he made her feel seen, truly seen, for the first time since her father's death. Not as a servant, not as a function, but as a person of value and substance. How could she resist? She was only 22, had known so little kindness in her life, and possessed a heart that, despite her best efforts at self-protection, had remained dangerously tender. Mrs. Drummond watched this unfolding disaster with the grim satisfaction of Cassandra witnessing her prophecies confirmed. She attempted to intervene directly one morning, cornering Rosalind in the stillroom where the girl was preparing lavender sachets. The housekeeper spoke with unusual gentleness, explaining that she had seen such situations before, always with the same tragic conclusion. Gentlemen like Lieutenant Beauchamp did not marry women like them, no matter what pretty words they spoke. At best, Rosalind might become his mistress, ruined and dependent upon his continued favor. At worst, she would find herself cast aside, reputation destroyed, prospects annihilated. Did the girl understand? Did she comprehend what she was risking? Rosalind listened with downcast eyes, murmured agreement, and privately believed that Mrs. Drummond simply did not understand the depth of feeling between herself and Henry. Their situation was different, their connection genuine. Henry had hinted, more than hinted, at finding a way to be together respectably. She need only be patient, trust him, and all would be well. The housekeeper saw the stubborn set of Rosalind's jaw and recognized defeat. She could do nothing more, save watch and wait for the inevitable catastrophe. The Viscountess, meanwhile, had begun to sense something amiss. She was not a foolish woman, merely a distracted one. And even distraction could not entirely blind her to the charged atmosphere that crackled between her lady's maid and her guest. She attempted to address the matter obliquely one evening, whilst Rosalind dressed her hair for dinner. She remarked that Lieutenant Beauchamp seemed much improved, that he would doubtless be returning to London soon to visit his family. Such visits were important for young gentlemen of quality, she observed carefully. There were expectations, obligations, arrangements that must be attended to. Families of that rank typically had very specific plans for their sons' futures. Rosalind's hands faltered for just a moment before resuming their work. She understood the warning, recognized the kindness beneath it. But understanding and acceptance were vastly different things. That night, she found Henry waiting for her in the conservatory after the household had retired. This had become their custom, these stolen moments in the fragrant darkness, surrounded by exotic blooms that Lord Harrington collected with the enthusiasm of a besotted suitor. It was wildly improper, dangerously reckless, and Rosalind knew she should refuse to attend. But she came anyway, drawn by a force she could no longer resist. Henry stood by the fountain, moonlight streaming through the glass walls, turning him silver. He reached for her hands as she approached, and she noted how his injured shoulder had healed, how he moved with increasing ease. Soon he would have no need of her attendance, no excuse for their continued proximity. Perhaps he sensed her thoughts, for he spoke of plans for the first time with concrete detail rather than vague promises. He would need to return to London soon, he explained, to settle certain family matters. There were expectations he must address, obligations he could not ignore. But she must trust him, believe in him. Once these tedious business were concluded, he would return for her. They would find a way to be together. How precisely? Rosalind dared to ask. By what means could a lady's maid and a gentleman of his rank unite respectably? Henry's answer was masterful in its evasion. He spoke of love conquering all obstacles, of his determination to defy convention, of his willingness to endure his family's displeasure for her sake. He painted a picture of modest domestic happiness, a small estate somewhere, a quiet life free from society's constraints, the two of them together against the world. It was pure fantasy, of course, but Rosalind, desperate to believe, accepted it as truth. He kissed her then, more insistently than before, his hands moving from her face to her waist to the small of her back. She should have pulled away, should have maintained the distance that was her only protection. Instead, she leaned into him, returning his kiss with an ardor born of loneliness and longing. They did not cross the final boundary that night. Not yet. But they approached it closely enough that both understood it was only a matter of time. From the shadows near the conservatory door, Sebastian Wycliffe observed this scene with emotions too complex to name. Jealousy, certainly, though he had no right to such feelings. Concern for Rosalind, whose innocence was being systematically dismantled by his friend's selfishness. Anger at Henry, whose refusal to consider consequences bordered on criminal. And beneath it all, a bone-deep weariness with his own powerlessness to prevent this disaster. He could reveal the truth to Rosalind, could tell her that Henry was expected to marry the daughter of a prominent colonel, that arrangements had been discussed before their departure for the peninsula, that his family would never countenance a match with a servant. But what good would such revelation serve? She would not believe him, would think him motivated by jealousy or spite. And Henry would simply deny it, spin some new fiction to explain away the inconvenient facts. Better to remain silent, Sebastian decided, and position himself to salvage what he could from the wreckage when disaster inevitably struck. The following week brought news that accelerated events toward their tragic conclusion. A letter arrived from Henry's father, the Earl of Wrexham, demanding his son's immediate return to London. There were matters requiring his attention, family business that could not be delayed. The Earl's tone suggested this was not a request, but a command. Henry's response to this summons was telling. He became agitated, withdrawn, spending long hours alone in his chamber. When he did emerge, he sought Rosalind with almost frantic intensity, as though storing up reserves of her presence against coming deprivation. He confided to her that his father was becoming impatient with his prolonged convalescence, that there were pressures being applied, expectations he could not entirely ignore. But she must not worry, he insisted. He would handle everything. He would make his father understand. She need only wait for him, trust him, and all would be well. Looking back, one might wonder how Rosalind could have been so credulous, so willing to believe promises that rang hollow even in the speaking. But love, especially first love, possesses a peculiar alchemy that transforms doubt into faith, suspicion into trust. And Rosalind had so little experience of the world beyond Thornbridge, so few defenses against a determined seducer. 3 days before Henry's scheduled departure, everything changed. It happened in the summer house at the far end of the garden, a pretty structure of white-painted wood where the family sometimes took tea on particularly fine days. Henry had sent word through one of the footmen that he needed to speak with Rosalind urgently, that she should meet him there at twilight when the household was occupied with dinner preparations. She knew this was dangerous, knew that meeting a gentleman alone in such a secluded location courted disaster. Mrs. Drummond would have locked her in her room had she known. The Viscountess would have been horrified. Even her own better judgment screamed warnings she chose to ignore. But Henry had sounded desperate in his message, and Rosalind could not bear the thought of refusing him. She arrived at the summer house as the sun sank low, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. Henry was waiting, pacing the small interior like a caged animal. When he saw her, relief flooded his features, and he crossed to her in 3 swift strides, pulling her into an embrace more desperate than tender. What followed was a masterpiece of manipulation, though Rosalind would not recognize it as such for many months to come. Henry spoke urgently of his departure, of his fears that once he returned to London, forces beyond his control would conspire to keep them apart. His family was already pressuring him toward an advantageous match, some colonel's daughter with a substantial dowry. They cared nothing for his feelings, only for connections and fortune. But he would not submit to their plans, he insisted. He would find a way to be with Rosalind. She must simply trust him, believe in him, give him this one memory to sustain him through the trials ahead. And there, in the gathering dusk of the summer house, with the scent of jasmine heavy in the air and the world reduced to just the 2 of them, Henry Beauchamp systematically dismantled the last of Rosalind Thatcher's defenses. He kissed her with increasing urgency, his hands moving over her body with practiced skill. When she hesitated, he spoke of love, of commitment, of how they were already bound together in spirit, if not yet in law. They were practically married, he murmured against her throat. What did a ceremony matter compared to the truth of their hearts? And would she truly send him back to London without this token of her faith, this proof that she believed in their future together? It was sophistry of the most contemptible sort. But Rosalind, overwhelmed by emotion and inexperience, could not recognize the lies beneath the poetry. In the end, she surrendered, not to force, for Henry employed none, but to the far more insidious weapons of false promises and manufactured urgency. Afterwards, as they lay together in the summer house with evening shadows gathering around them, Rosalind felt a strange combination of emotions. There was tenderness, certainly. Henry held her gently, stroking her hair, murmuring endearments. But beneath the surface warmth, something cold had taken root in her chest, some inchoate understanding that she had just crossed a boundary from which there could be no return. Henry spoke of the future, of his return, of the life they would build together once he had settled matters with his family. 6 weeks, he promised. 8 at most. Then he would come back for her, and they would be together properly, respectably. She wanted so desperately to believe him. So she forced down the cold thing in her chest and smiled and pretended that everything would indeed work out as he promised. They parted separately to avoid suspicion. Henry first, then Rosalind after a careful interval. She returned to the house through the servants' entrance, slipped up to her room beneath the eaves, and only then, in the privacy of darkness, allowed herself to acknowledge the enormity of what had occurred. She was ruined. By the strictest definition of the term, she was no longer respectable. If anyone discovered what had transpired in the summer house, she would be dismissed without reference, unemployable, destined for the streets or workhouse. But Henry loved her, she told herself firmly. He would return for her. He had promised. Gentlemen kept their promises, particularly to women they had so thoroughly compromised. Didn't they? In his chamber in the East Wing, Sebastian Wickliffe stood at his window and watched the summer house with a sick certainty in his gut. He had seen Henry slip away during dinner, had noticed Rosalind's absence from the servants' hall. He knew his friend too well to doubt what was occurring. And he knew, with the terrible clarity of experience, that Henry would not keep whatever promises he had made in passion's heat. Henry never did. Sebastian closed his eyes and wondered whether he should have tried harder to prevent this, whether there was anything he might have done differently. But he knew the answer. He had no authority over Henry, no claim on Rosalind. He was merely an observer, a witness to a tragedy he had seen coming, but been powerless to prevent. Tomorrow, Henry would depart for London, and Sebastian, who should have left with him, would find reasons to extend his stay at Thornbridge, because someone needed to be present for the aftermath. Someone needed to salvage what could be salvaged from the wreckage. And if anyone asked why a captain would linger at a country house with no particular claim on his attention, he would plead continued convalescence, the need for country air, anything but the truth. That he had fallen hopelessly, impossibly in love with his friend's discarded conquest, and could not bear to abandon her to face alone whatever consequences Henry's selfishness would bring. 3 days later, Lieutenant Henry Beauchamp departed Thornbridge in a shower of gratitude and good wishes. He thanked Lord and Lady Harrington profusely for their hospitality, clapped Sebastian on the shoulder with hearty affection, and managed a private word with Rosalind in which he reiterated all his previous promises. 6 weeks, he whispered, 8 at most. Then he would return for her, and everything would be well. Rosalind watched his carriage disappear down the drive with tears streaming down her face. One hand pressed protectively to her abdomen where she already suspected, though she could not yet know for certain, that Henry had left her a far more tangible reminder of his regard than mere promises. The first week after Henry's departure passed in a fog of misery that Rosalind hid behind her usual mask of competent efficiency. She attended the Viscountess, performed her duties flawlessly, and retreated each night to her room beneath the eaves where she reread Henry's letters. 3 had arrived already, full of affectionate phrases and vague promises, until the paper grew soft from handling. Mrs. Drummond watched her with narrowed eyes, but said nothing. The housekeeper had developed a sixth sense for trouble amongst her staff, and Rosalind Thatcher positively radiated guilt. But without concrete evidence of wrongdoing, even Mrs. Drummond could not justify direct accusation. Sebastian Wickliffe remained at Thornbridge, ostensibly recovering his strength before returning to London. In truth, his leg had healed adequately months ago, and his remaining injuries were of the sort that country air could not address. But Lord Harrington seemed pleased by his continued presence, and the Viscountess made no objection, so he stayed, moving through the house like a grey ghost, watching and waiting. The second week brought the first suspicion. Rosalind woke one morning with a peculiar queasiness that persisted despite her best efforts to ignore it. She attributed it to anxiety. She had been sleeping poorly, eating little, her nerves wound tight with worry over Henry's prolonged absence. But the nausea returned the following morning, and the morning after that, until she could no longer deny its significance. She was 5 weeks gone since that evening in the summer house, and her courses, usually reliable as the tide, had failed to appear. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. She sat on the edge of her narrow bed, one hand pressed to her mouth to stifle the sob that threatened to escape, and understood with perfect clarity that her life as she had known it was over. An unmarried woman carrying a child had no future. The best she could hope for was dismissal without reference. More likely, she would face public humiliation, potential prosecution for moral turpitude, and the certainty of destitution. The workhouse loomed before her with all its horrors: brutal labor, starvation rations, the likelihood of dying in childbirth with no one to care for the infant that survived. Unless Henry kept his promise, unless he returned for her as he had sworn, unless the fantasy he had woven proved somehow real. She clung to that hope with desperate intensity. Henry would come back. He had promised. Gentlemen kept their promises, particularly to women carrying their children. He would marry her, legitimize the babe, whisk her away from this nightmare before anyone discovered her condition. Wouldn't he? 3 more weeks dragged past with agonizing slowness. Henry's letters continued to arrive, but their tone had begun to shift in ways Rosalind tried desperately not to notice. He spoke less of missing her and more of complications in London, of family pressures, of matters requiring his attention. His promises of return became vaguer, pushed further into an ever-receding future. And still, Rosalind's belly remained flat, her condition as yet undetectable. But she knew it was only a matter of time. Soon, her dresses would begin to fit differently. Soon, Mrs. Drummond's sharp eyes would notice the morning sickness, the fatigue, the 1,000 small signs of a woman with child. The reckoning came sooner than she expected. One morning, as Rosalind made her way through the servants' corridor, she found Mrs. Drummond blocking her path, arms folded, eyes boring into her with that terrible penetration that missed nothing. The housekeeper's voice was low, measured, deadly. She observed that Rosalind had not been well for weeks, that her color was poor, her appetite diminished. She hoped, with pointed emphasis, that it was not anything that might bring shame upon this house. Rosalind stammered some excuse about a stomach complaint, but Mrs. Drummond's expression made clear she believed not a word. The housekeeper said nothing more, simply stepped aside to let her pass. But the message was unmistakable. Time was running out. She needed to tell someone, needed help. But who could she possibly confide in? The Viscountess, kind as she was, would be bound by propriety to dismiss her. Mrs. Drummond would show no mercy. The other servants would shun her as damaged goods. She was utterly, terribly alone. The 9th week after Henry's departure brought the letter Rosalind had been dreading. It arrived on a Tuesday morning in late August, when summer was beginning its slow slide toward autumn. She recognized Henry's hand immediately and carried the letter to her room with trembling fingers, some terrible instinct warning her that this missive was different from the others. She was correct. Henry wrote with apparent regret that his return to Thornbridge must be delayed indefinitely. Family matters had become more complicated than anticipated. His father was unwell, requiring his attendance. There were obligations he could not shirk, expectations he must meet. He hoped she understood. He promised to write again soon with better news. There was no mention of marriage, no reference to her condition, which he could not know about, as she had been too frightened to confess it by letter. No concrete plans for their future together, simply polite phrases of regret and vague promises that rang hollow even on paper. Rosalind read the letter 3 times, each reading driving the knife of reality deeper into her heart. Then she folded it carefully, placed it with the others in her small trunk, and allowed herself precisely 5 minutes of silent weeping before washing her face and returning to her duties. She understood now. Henry was not coming back. He had never intended to come back. Everything he had promised in the summer house had been lies, pretty words designed to ease her surrender. She had been a fool, a naive, desperate fool who had believed that a gentleman could genuinely care for a servant. And now she would pay for that foolishness with everything she had. 2 days later, Rosalind was gathering herbs in the kitchen garden when the world suddenly tilted sideways. The nausea that had plagued her mornings chose that moment to assert itself with vicious intensity. She barely made it to the edge of the garden before losing what little breakfast she had managed to consume. When she straightened, wiping her mouth with the back of her hand, she found Captain Wycliffe standing nearby, his gray-blue eyes fixed upon her with an expression that mingled concern and something else, a knowledge, perhaps, of what her sickness signified. They stared at one another for a long moment. Then Sebastian spoke quietly, his voice carrying none of the judgment she expected. He asked if she was well, though his tone suggested he already knew she was not. When she stammered some excuse about spoiled milk, he simply nodded, but his eyes remained troubled. That evening, as twilight gathered in the garden, Rosalind found herself there again, drawn by she knew not what compulsion. She sat on the stone bench near the fountain, one hand pressed to her still flat abdomen, and tried to formulate some plan for survival. She could write to Henry again, confess her condition, beg him to honor his promises. But she knew with bone-deep certainty that such a letter would accomplish nothing save hasten her dismissal once he shared its contents with his family, as he surely would, to explain away any obligation to her. She could throw herself on the Viscountess's mercy, explain everything, hope for compassion. But compassion had limits, and no amount of sympathy would allow a lady to keep a pregnant, unmarried maid in her household. She could flee before her condition became obvious, seek work elsewhere under a false name. But without references, visibly unwell, she would find no respectable position. And lies had a way of unraveling. She could end the pregnancy through means whispered about in the servants' hall. Certain herbs, certain women in certain villages who provided certain services. But even if she could bring herself to commit such an act, it was illegal, dangerous, and likely to leave her dead or permanently injured. Every path led to destruction. At best, she faced dismissal without character, public shame before the parish magistrates, and the certainty of destitution. The workhouse loomed before her with all its horrors: brutal labor, starvation rations, the likelihood of dying in childbirth with no one to care for the infant that survived. She was so lost in her despairing thoughts that she did not hear Sebastian approach until he spoke from directly behind her, asking permission to join her on the bench. She started violently, then nodded mutely. He sat, maintaining a careful distance, and for several minutes neither spoke. The garden was peaceful in the gathering dusk, birds calling their evening songs, the fountain's gentle splash providing soothing counterpoint. Finally, Sebastian spoke. He observed that she seemed troubled, that he had noticed her distress growing daily. If there was anything he might do to assist her, any service he might render, he hoped she would not hesitate to ask. The kindness in his voice broke something inside Rosalind. Before she could stop herself, before caution or pride could intervene, the whole wretched story came pouring out. Her attachment to Henry, the promises made, the evening in the summer house, the letters that had grown increasingly distant, and finally, the terrible certainty of her current condition. She wept as she spoke, great wrenching sobs that she tried futilely to muffle, expecting at any moment that Sebastian would stand in disgust and walk away, leaving her to face her shame alone. He did not move. He simply sat beside her, occasionally offering his handkerchief when her tears overwhelmed her ability to speak, and listened until the entire sorry tale had been told. When at last she fell silent, exhausted by confession, Sebastian remained quiet for so long that Rosalind feared she had shocked him beyond speech. Then he began to speak, slowly, carefully, as though weighing each word. He said that he had suspected something of the sort was occurring, that he had tried to warn Henry, had attempted to prevent this outcome, but had failed, that he was deeply sorry for his failure and for her suffering, that Henry had behaved abominably without honor or consideration for the consequences of his actions. And then, most astonishing of all, he said that there might be a solution if Rosalind could bring herself to trust him. She was carrying a child that required a name. She needed a husband, and quickly, before her condition became obvious. He could provide both, if she would accept his offer. Rosalind stared at him in utter incomprehension. She must have misheard, she stammered. He could not possibly be suggesting, but he was. Sebastian spoke with the matter-of-fact tone of a man proposing a business arrangement. He said he had no particular prospects, no family pressing him toward any advantageous match. The war had left him with a small competence, enough to maintain a modest household. He had been considering retirement from military life in any case. What he proposed was a marriage of convenience. He would give her child his name, provide her with respectability and protection, ask nothing in return save the appearance of a normal union. "Why?" Rosalind whispered, her voice barely audible. Why would he do such a thing? What possible benefit could such an arrangement offer him? Sebastian's response was indirect. He spoke of honor, of responsibility, of his friendship with Henry, and his sense that he bore some culpability for failing to prevent this disaster. But beneath the rational explanations, Rosalind sensed something else, some deeper motivation he did not voice. She should have questioned further, should have demanded clearer answers. But she was drowning, and he was offering rescue, and desperate people do not interrogate the motives of their saviors. She asked for time to consider his proposal, though they both knew she had no real choice. Within days, her condition would become impossible to hide. Once Mrs. Drummond discovered the truth, there would be no saving her. Sebastian simply nodded and said he would wait upon her decision. Then he rose, executed a small bow, and walked back toward the house, leaving Rosalind alone with her turbulent thoughts. That night, she wrote one final letter to Henry. She explained her condition plainly, without drama or accusation. She asked whether he intended to honor the promises he had made. She gave him one last opportunity to claim her, to legitimize their child, to prove that something of honor remained beneath his charm. She sent the letter the following morning and received his response within a week. Henry wrote with apparent devastation. He explained that he could not marry her. His family had already arranged another match, a union that had been planned since childhood, impossible to escape. He enclosed a bank draft for £20 and expressed his sincere hope that she would use it to establish herself elsewhere, far from Gloucestershire, where the scandal might follow her. He wished her well. £20. The price of 4 years' careful virtue, of all her father's teachings, of every hope she had cherished for a respectable future. She might have laughed had she not been crying so hard. The following evening, she found Sebastian in the library and accepted his offer. The wedding took place exactly 1 week later in the village church, conducted by the elderly vicar who had known Rosalind since her father's time. It was a small, grim affair, witnessed only by Lord and Lady Harrington, the Viscountess tearful, the Viscount clearly baffled by the sudden turn of events, and Mrs. Drummond, whose expression suggested she understood far more than the others and approved of none of it. Sebastian had arranged everything with military efficiency. He had spoken privately with Lord Harrington, explaining that he and Miss Thatcher had formed an attachment during his convalescence, that their feelings had progressed to the point where marriage seemed the natural conclusion. It was perhaps hasty, he acknowledged, but war had taught him not to defer happiness when it might be grasped. The Viscount, who had noticed nothing whatsoever of the drama unfolding beneath his roof, accepted this explanation without question. A wounded officer marrying a respectable lady's maid seemed perfectly reasonable, commendable even, showing proper gratitude for excellent care during convalescence. The Viscountess harbored more suspicions, but kept them to herself. She had observed enough to guess at the truth, or something close to it, but chose to interpret Sebastian's actions as redemptive rather than suspicious. If Captain Wycliffe wished to marry her maid, she would not stand in the way. Indeed, she felt a mixture of relief and guilt. Relief that Rosalind would be respectably settled, guilt that she had not protected the girl more carefully from whatever had occurred. Only Mrs. Drummond saw the situation with perfect clarity. The child's timing would reveal everything once it arrived. But by then, Rosalind would be a married woman, the babe legitimate in the eyes of law, if not of biology. It was a better outcome than the girl deserved, but Mrs. Drummond had lived long enough to know that justice and mercy were not always the same thing. The ceremony itself was a blur in Rosalind's memory. She stood beside Sebastian in her best dress, dark blue, hastily altered to allow for her changing figure, and repeated vows she could barely hear over the roaring in her ears. Sebastian's voice remained steady throughout, his responses clear and firm, as though he were accepting a military commission rather than binding himself for life to a woman carrying another man's child. When the vicar pronounced them man and wife, Sebastian took her hand with the same careful gentleness he had shown throughout their brief acquaintance and pressed a chaste kiss to her forehead. Not her lips. That intimacy, apparently, was a step too far even in the performance of matrimony. They returned to Thornbridge in the Viscountess's carriage, sitting in awkward silence whilst the woman who had been Rosalind's employer offered increasingly desperate congratulations. A wedding breakfast had been prepared, though no one seemed to have much appetite. Lord Harrington made a toast to happiness and long life. The Viscountess presented Rosalind with a beautiful shawl as a wedding gift. Chattas. Drummond offered nothing, save a look that clearly said the girl was getting far better than she deserved. Through it all, Rosalind felt as though she were watching the scene from a great distance, as though it were happening to someone else entirely. By late afternoon, Sebastian had settled his affairs with Lord Harrington and prepared for their departure. He had taken a small house in a village some 30 miles distant, he explained to Rosalind, a respectable place where they could live quietly, where no one knew them or their history. He had sent ahead to engage minimal staff. They would leave immediately to avoid excessive gossip. Rosalind packed her few belongings in a daze. The Viscountess embraced her with genuine warmth, pressed additional gifts into her hands, made her promise to write. Mrs. Drummond's farewell was considerably cooler, but not unkind. The other servants offered awkward congratulations tinged with clear relief. Rosalind's sudden marriage had provided delicious gossip without requiring them to shun one of their own. By evening, Rosalind found herself in Sebastian's modest carriage, heading toward a future she could not begin to imagine. She sat as far from her new husband as the interior allowed, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her eyes fixed determinedly on the passing countryside. Sebastian made no attempt at conversation. He simply sat across from her, occasionally glancing her direction with an expression she could not decipher, and allowed the silence to stretch between them like a chasm. They stopped once at a coaching inn for refreshment, but Rosalind could swallow only tea, her stomach still rebelling against food. Sebastian noted her difficulty with a small frown, but said nothing, simply paid the reckoning and handed her back into the carriage with the same careful courtesy. It was full dark when they arrived at the house Sebastian had let, a pretty stone cottage on the outskirts of a village whose name Rosalind did not catch. A housekeeper waited to greet them, a stout woman of middle years who introduced herself as Mrs. Albright and showed them to their respective chambers with brisk efficiency. Respective chambers, separate rooms. Rosalind had not dared hope for such consideration, had steeled herself for demands she would have no choice but to meet. The relief that flooded through her was almost painful in its intensity. Mrs. Albright left them in the small parlor with tea and cakes, promising supper within the hour. When the door closed behind her, Rosalind found herself alone with her husband for the first time since the ceremony, and the weight of what she had done, what he had done for her, crashed down with suffocating force. She tried to thank him, but the words emerged as broken fragments. She attempted to explain that she understood the enormity of his sacrifice, that she would endeavor not to be a burden, that she hoped. Sebastian cut her off with a gentle gesture. He asked her to sit, then took a chair across from her, maintaining a careful distance that was becoming characteristic of all his interactions with her. He spoke quietly, but firmly. She was to understand certain things clearly, he said. First, this was not a conventional marriage, and would not become one unless both parties desired otherwise. He asked nothing from her save the public appearance of a normal union. Second, the child she carried would be raised as his own, given his name, treated with all the care and affection due any infant. Third, she was his wife, and therefore entitled to his protection, his support, and his respect. He would honor those obligations regardless of the circumstances that had brought them to this arrangement. And fourth, his gray-blue eyes met hers with uncomfortable directness. She was never to contact Henry Beauchamp again. The man had forfeited any claim to her or her child. Any future communication between them would be viewed as a breach of their marital contract and grounds for immediate dissolution of the arrangement. Did she understand? Could she accept these terms? Rosalind nodded mutely. She understood. More than that, she was grateful, intensely, overwhelmingly grateful for his coldness, his formality, his clear desire to keep distance between them. At least this she could comprehend. At least this made sense after the terrible confusion of Henry's false warmth. Sebastian seemed satisfied with her agreement. He rose, said he would leave her to rest before supper, and departed with a small bow as though taking leave of a casual acquaintance rather than his wife of mere hours. Left alone, Rosalind pressed both hands to her face and tried to understand what her life had become. She had awakened this morning as Miss Rosalind Thatcher, lady's maid, ruined woman, carrying a bastard child. She would sleep tonight as Mrs. Sebastian Wycliffe, respectably married, her child legitimate in the eyes of law, if not of God. She should have felt relief, gratitude, some modicum of peace. Instead, She felt only a crushing sense of loss, for the life she would never have, for the love she had believed genuine, for the innocent girl who had trusted pretty promises and paid the ultimate price for that trust. In the chamber above, Sebastian Wycliffe stood at his window and wondered what manner of fool bound himself for life to a woman who loved another man, who carried that man's child, who had agreed to marry him only out of desperate necessity. A fool with a scarred face and a shattered leg and a heart that had, despite all wisdom and self-protection, fixed itself upon a gray-eyed lady's maid who could never love him in return. He had told himself he was acting from honor, from responsibility, from his failure to protect her from Henry's predations. These were all true, as far as they went. But beneath those noble justifications lay a more uncomfortable truth. He wanted her. Not physically, or not only physically, but fundamentally. He wanted the right to protect her, to provide for her, to see her smile again, as she had in those early days before Henry destroyed her innocence. He wanted to give her child a name and a future. He wanted to prove that not all men were selfish creatures like his former friend. He wanted, in short, to be the man she believed Henry to be, honorable, steadfast, true to his word. The irony was not lost on him. He had won her hand through another man's betrayal, had claimed her when she had no other choice. What manner of honor was that? None whatsoever. But he would make the best of it. Would prove through actions rather than empty promises that he could be trusted. Would hope that someday, perhaps, gratitude might ripen into something warmer. Or if not, well. He had endured worse disappointments. At least this way, she and the child would be safe, cared for, protected from the world's cruelties. It would have to be enough. The months that followed established a pattern that would define the Wycliffes' peculiar marriage. Sebastian maintained a formal distance, treating Rosalind with unfailing courtesy but no particular warmth. They took meals together in strained silence, broken only by the most necessary conversation. He provided generously for her comfort, hired a personal maid to attend her, consulted her on household decisions, and asked nothing whatsoever in return, save that she maintain the fiction of marital normalcy when others were present. The sole sound in the small dining room was the clink of silver against porcelain. They sat at opposite ends of a table that seemed vast as a battlefield, passing the salt without their eyes meeting, each a prisoner in the fortress of courtesy he had constructed to protect her. They lived as polite strangers sharing a house, bound by legal contract, but separated by an emotional chasm that seemed to widen rather than narrow with each passing week. Rosalind found this arrangement both relief and torment. She was grateful for Sebastian's restraint, his refusal to exercise his conjugal rights, his apparent contentment with their cold coexistence. After Henry's passionate deceptions, Sebastian's emotional distance felt almost like safety. But beneath the gratitude lurked a confusion she could not quite name. She had expected, what? Demands? Resentment? Some acknowledgement of the tremendous sacrifice he had made? Instead, Sebastian treated their marriage as one might treat a business partnership, efficiently managed but entirely impersonal. She knew she should be thankful. She was thankful. And yet, in the dark watches of the night, she sometimes found herself wondering what it might be like to have a husband who wanted her, who looked at her with warmth rather than careful neutrality. Such thoughts she quickly suppressed. She had no right to want more than she had been given. Sebastian had saved her from ruin. That he found no pleasure in their union was hardly surprising. She carried another man's bastard and had come to him with neither affection nor fortune. What man would desire such a wife? As autumn deepened toward winter, Rosalind's condition became increasingly obvious. Her gowns required constant alteration. Morning sickness plagued her despite having entered the second trimester. Mrs. Albright clucked over her with maternal concern, preparing strengthening broths and tisanes, never once suggesting by word or expression that she doubted the child's legitimacy. The village accepted the Wycliffes without undue curiosity. A wounded officer and his quietly spoken wife merited neither excitement nor suspicion. They attended church regularly, nodded politely to neighbors, and maintained the sort of respectable obscurity that characterized so many country gentry of moderate means. Only one incident threatened their careful peace. In late November, a letter arrived for Rosalind bearing Henry's familiar hand. She found it on the hall table one morning and stared at it with the sort of horrified fascination one might direct toward a poisonous serpent. She should destroy it unopened, should take it immediately to Sebastian, should do anything except what she actually did, which was to slip it into her pocket and retreat to her chamber to read in private. Henry wrote with his characteristic charm, though even through ink and paper, something false rang in his tone. He had heard through mutual acquaintances that she had married, quite suddenly, apparently, and wished to offer his congratulations. He hoped she was well, that her husband treated her kindly, that she harbored no ill will toward him for his inability to honor the promises circumstances had made impossible to keep. He remained, as always, her devoted friend. The letter contained no bank draft this time, no tangible acknowledgement of his responsibility. Simply words, pretty, empty words that would have moved her 6 months ago, but now inspired only a hollow ache. She should have burned it. Should have told Sebastian immediately of its arrival. Instead, she tucked it away in her writing desk, unable to quite destroy this last connection to the man she had loved, or thought she loved, or wanted desperately to believe she had loved because the alternative, that she had surrendered everything for a fantasy, was too painful to contemplate. Sebastian knew of the letter's arrival within hours. Mrs. Albright, protective of her mistress and suspicious of anything from Gloucestershire, mentioned it to him privately. When he approached Rosalind that evening, asking if she had received any correspondence of note, her guilty flush confirmed everything. He did not lose his temper. Sebastian never lost his temper. He simply reminded her, in that carefully neutral tone, of their agreement. No contact with Henry Beauchamp. If further letters arrived, they were to be destroyed unopened or delivered directly to him. Was this understood? Rosalind's shame burned hot, but she nodded agreement. When Sebastian requested the letter itself, she retrieved it with trembling hands and watched as he fed it to the drawing-room fire without reading a single word. Only after it had been reduced to ash did he speak again, and then it was merely to ask if she required anything for her comfort before he retired. She shook her head mutely, and he departed, leaving her alone with the growing understanding that she had wounded him somehow, had violated a trust she had not realized he placed in her. The incident created a new constraint between them, an additional layer of formality and distance. Rosalind berated herself for her foolishness, for her inability to completely excise Henry from her heart, despite all the evidence of his unworthiness. December brought the first snow, and with it, increasing discomfort as Rosalind entered her final trimester. The child moved vigorously now, keeping her awake at night, making even simple tasks exhausting. Mrs. Albright fussed with increasing concern, insisting Rosalind rest more, eat more, take better care. Sebastian, too, showed signs of worry, though he maintained his usual reserve. He engaged a midwife from the village, a competent woman of middle years, who examined Rosalind and declared everything progressing normally. He ensured the nursery was prepared, supplied with everything a child might require. He even, in a gesture that brought tears to Rosalind's eyes, commissioned a beautiful wooden cradle from the village carpenter, carved with delicate flowers and birds. Through all these preparations, he never once acknowledged that the child was not his. Never suggested by word or deed that he viewed the coming infant as anything other than his own. On Christmas Eve, as they sat by the fire after a quiet dinner, Rosalind finally gathered courage to ask the question that had plagued her for months. Why? She whispered into the fire-lit silence. Why had he truly married her? She understood honor and responsibility, but surely those obligations did not extend to binding oneself for life to a ruined stranger. What had motivated such extraordinary mercy? Sebastian was silent for so long that Rosalind thought he would not answer. Then he spoke, slowly, as though each word required careful consideration. He said that honor was indeed part of it. He had failed to protect her from Henry's selfishness, and that failure demanded redress. But honor alone would have required only financial assistance, not marriage. He paused, his gaze fixed on the fire rather than on her, and continued with evident difficulty. The truth was, he said, that he had admired her from almost the first moment they met. Her intelligence, her dignity, despite her circumstances, her gentle competence, these things had attracted him in ways he had not initially recognized. When he realized what Henry intended, he had been motivated as much by jealousy as by any noble concern for her well-being. He had wanted her, he admitted baldly. Not in Henry's careless, destructive way, but fundamentally. He had wanted the right to protect her, to provide for her, to see her safely through life's troubles. When disaster struck, offering marriage had seemed the only honorable way to claim what he had desired all along. He finished by acknowledging that this confession likely made her uncomfortable. She need not fear any demands based upon it. He had given his word regarding the terms of their marriage and would honor those terms absolutely. But she had asked for truth, and truth, however awkward, she deserved. Rosalind sat frozen, her hands clasped protectively over her swollen belly, trying to process this revelation. Sebastian had wanted her? Had married her from desire rather than pure duty? The idea seemed preposterous. She was a servant, ruined, carrying another man's child. What could he possibly find desirable in such wreckage? And yet his gray-blue eyes, when he finally met her gaze, held something that might have been longing, carefully suppressed but unmistakable once she knew to look for it. Before she could formulate any response, pain lanced through her abdomen with shocking intensity. She gasped, doubling forward, and Sebastian was at her side instantly, his reserve forgotten in the face of her distress. It was too soon, nearly 3 weeks too soon, but the child had apparently decided otherwise. What followed was a nightmare of pain and terror that lasted nearly 14 hours. The midwife was summoned, Mrs. Albright prepared the necessary items, and Sebastian paced the corridor outside Rosalind's chamber with the barely restrained desperation of a man watching the person he cared for most suffer beyond his ability to help. The labor proved difficult. The child was positioned awkwardly, and Rosalind, weakened by months of anxiety and poor appetite, had little strength to draw upon. Twice, the midwife emerged with a grim expression to warn Sebastian that he should prepare himself for the worst. Twice, he refused to accept such preparation, demanding instead that everything possible be done to save both mother and child. When at last the infant's cries pierced the terrible silence of that long night, Sebastian nearly collapsed with relief. Mrs. Albright emerged minutes later, her face wreathed in smiles despite the exhaustion evident in every line, to announce that he had a daughter, small but healthy, with a remarkable set of lungs and her mother's gray eyes. "And the mother?" Sebastian demanded, his voice hoarse from hours of suppressed terror. Mrs. Albright's smile faltered slightly. The mistress was alive but very weak. She had lost considerable blood. The next few days would be critical, but the midwife was optimistic, and Mrs. Albright herself had seen women recover from worse. Sebastian brushed past her into the chamber. Decorum be damned. Rosalind lay pale as death against the pillows, her auburn hair damp with sweat, her breathing shallow. But her eyes opened when he approached, and she managed a weak smile. In the cradle beside the bed, wrapped in soft blankets, lay the smallest creature Sebastian had ever beheld. Dark hair crowned her tiny head, and when she opened her eyes, gray as a winter morning, he felt something shift irreversibly in his chest. This was not his child by blood. But in that moment, gazing at the infant who had very nearly cost Rosalind her life, Sebastian understood that biology mattered not at all. She was his daughter in every way that truly counted. He reached into the cradle with hands that had held weapons, had dealt death, had grown accustomed to destruction, and lifted the child with infinite gentleness. She weighed almost nothing, this scrap of humanity, yet she carried the weight of two futures, Rosalind's and his own. "Our daughter," he said quietly, looking at Rosalind. "Not your daughter, or Henry's daughter, but ours. If she would accept him as father, he would consider it the greatest honor of his life." Rosalind's eyes filled with tears, whether from exhaustion, relief, or emotion, even she could not have said. She whispered her agreement, her gratitude, and then, as sleep finally claimed her, something that might have been the beginning of affection. The weeks that followed were a blur of recovery and adjustment. Rosalind remained weak for longer than anyone liked, requiring constant care and nourishment to regain her strength. The child, whom they named Eleanor Rose, after Sebastian's mother and Rosalind's father, proved a demanding tiny tyrant who slept poorly and ate constantly. Sebastian proved astonishingly capable with an infant. He walked Eleanor when she fussed in the small hours, learned to change her clothing without fumbling, sang military marching songs in a surprisingly pleasant baritone when nothing else would soothe her. He hired a wet nurse to supplement Rosalind's inadequate supply, interviewed nursery maids with the thoroughness of a general selecting officers, and generally threw himself into fatherhood with the same intensity he had once applied to military service. Rosalind, confined to her chamber for weeks of recovery, could only watch in amazement as the man who had maintained such careful distance transformed into a devoted father. He brought Eleanor to her several times daily for feeding and visits, narrated the child's various accomplishments with pride that seemed entirely genuine, and consulted Rosalind on every decision regarding their daughter's care. It was during one of these visits, when Eleanor was perhaps 6 weeks old, that the final truth emerged. Mrs. Albright brought the post with Rosalind's morning chocolate, and amongst the usual correspondence lay a letter from Gloucestershire. Not from Henry. Sebastian had arranged for any communication from him to be intercepted and destroyed, but from a friend of the Viscountess, a widow who occasionally wrote to Rosalind with news of the neighborhood. This letter, however, contained information of a different sort entirely. The widow wrote with evident excitement of a recent engagement announced in the Morning Post. Lieutenant Henry Beauchamp, second son of the Earl of Wrexham, to Miss Amelia Thornton, daughter of Colonel Sir Richard Thornton. The announcement noted that the couple had been promised to one another since childhood, that the colonel had served with distinction alongside the Earl during the American Wars, and that the families were delighted by the union. Since childhood. Promised since childhood. Rosalind read the letter 3 times, each reading crystallizing the truth she had desperately avoided acknowledging. Henry had never intended to marry her. From the very beginning, his promises had been lies. He had been engaged, formally, officially engaged, throughout their entire acquaintance. Every word he had spoken in the summer house, every vow he had made, had been deliberate deception. She had not been betrayed by circumstance or family pressure or cruel fortune. She had been betrayed by a man who had known exactly what he was doing and had done it anyway, who had calculated her seduction with the same precision he might have applied to a military maneuver. The realization should have destroyed her. Instead, oddly, it brought a kind of terrible clarity. She had not been special enough to keep, as she had tormented herself believing. She had simply been available, and Henry had taken what was offered without any intention of honoring the implied bargain. She sat with the letter in her lap, staring at nothing, until Sebastian entered with Eleanor for her midday feeding. He took one look at her face and asked what had occurred. When she silently handed him the letter, he read it quickly, his expression darkening with each line. He apologized then for not telling her sooner. He had known about the engagement, had known about it at Thornbridge, had tried to warn Henry away from pursuing her, had understood from the beginning that his friend had no intention of honoring his pretty promises. He had kept silent, thinking it would spare her pain to believe Henry might have meant well, even if circumstances prevented his return. He saw now that this had been a mistake, that allowing her to maintain illusions had been a cruelty rather than a kindness. Rosalind listened in numb silence. Then she asked the question that had been building in her chest since Christmas Eve. Did Sebastian still want her? Not out of pity or duty or obligation, but genuinely? Because she found, to her own surprise, that she might, if he truly desired it, be willing to make their marriage real in every sense. Sebastian froze, Eleanor still cradled in his arms, and stared at Rosalind as though she had begun speaking in tongues. She rushed on before courage could fail. She said that she understood now what he had tried to tell her at Christmas, that she was profoundly grateful for everything he had done, that she recognized the extraordinary mercy he had shown. But more than that, and here her voice dropped to barely a whisper, she had come to admire him deeply. His steadfastness, his honor, his gentle care of Eleanor, the way he had proven through actions rather than empty words that his promises could be trusted. She would not claim to love him as she had believed she loved Henry. She was not certain she understood what love truly meant anymore. But she respected him immensely, felt safe with him as she had never felt safe before, and thought perhaps that respect and safety might prove a firmer foundation than the passion and poetry that had led her so astray. If he still wanted a true marriage, she would be willing, no, she would be glad, to offer him that. The silence that followed stretched so long that Rosalind began to regret her boldness. Then Sebastian carefully transferred Eleanor to her cradle, crossed to where Rosalind sat, and lowered himself to one knee beside her chair with the care his injured leg still required. He took her hand, the first time he had touched her voluntarily since their wedding day, and spoke with the quiet intensity of a man who had kept his feelings locked away too long. He said that he had wanted her since Thornbridge, had married her knowing she might never return his regard, had accepted that their union might remain forever one of cold convenience. He had told himself it would be enough simply to care for her, to give Eleanor a father, to prove himself worthy even if she never saw him as anything other than a kind benefactor. But if she was offering more, if she truly meant what she said, then yes. God, yes. He wanted a real marriage with her. Wanted to be her husband in truth, not just in law. Wanted the right to hold her, to comfort her, to share her bed and her life completely. He would not rush her, he promised. Would give her whatever time she needed to be certain. But if she was certain already, if she truly meant this offer, then he would accept it with gratitude and devotion and every atom of his being. Rosalind looked at the man kneeling before her, this scarred, steady, honorable man who had saved her when he had no obligation to do so, who had claimed another man's child as his own, who had asked nothing in return for his extraordinary mercy. And she realized, with startling clarity, that what she felt for him was not gratitude alone. It was trust, admiration, affection. And beneath those safer emotions, the first tender shoots of something that might, given time and care, grow into genuine love. She told him she was certain. She placed her free hand against his scarred cheek and said she wanted to try, truly try, to make their marriage everything it could be. Sebastian's response required no words. He simply leaned forward and kissed her with a tenderness that acknowledged all they had endured, all they had lost, all they might yet build together. It was not the passionate, desperate kiss Henry had given her in the summer house. It was something better, a kiss that promised partnership rather than possession, steadiness rather than storm, truth rather than pretty lies. When they finally drew apart, Eleanor chose that moment to announce her displeasure at being ignored, and they both laughed, real laughter, unstrained, unforced, before Sebastian retrieved their daughter and brought her to Rosalind for feeding. And there, in the warm afternoon light of the nursery, with Eleanor nursing contentedly and Sebastian seated beside them, his hand covering Rosalind's, a family truly began. 2 years have the swiftness of dreams when happiness fills them, and the slow weight of eternity when misery darkens the days. For the Wycliffes, those 2 years passed as something between, not pure bliss, For life seldom grants such perfection, but steady, growing contentment that deepened with each passing season into something far stronger than fleeting joy. The transformation of their marriage from convenient fiction to genuine union proved gradual rather than sudden. That first kiss in the nursery did not magically erase months of careful distance and mutual wariness. But it opened a door that had been locked, allowing tenderness to seep slowly into the spaces between them. Sebastian moved from his separate chamber into Rosalind's within a month of their conversation, but their physical union began with remarkable gentleness. He courted her with the patience of a man who understood that trust, once shattered, required time to rebuild. There were evenings of simple companionship, hands held before the fire, kisses that asked rather than demanded, and eventually, intimacy that felt nothing like her desperate surrender in the summer house. Instead, it spoke of partnership, mutual care, the slow revelation of vulnerability on both sides. Rosalind learned during those months what love truly meant beyond poetry and passion. It meant Sebastian bringing her tea before she asked, having learned she could not properly wake without it. It meant his steady presence during Eleanor's childhood illnesses, walking the floor through long nights when fever made the child fretful. It meant his quiet pride when Rosalind began writing again, essays and observations she had suppressed for years, which he encouraged her to submit to magazines under a careful pseudonym. It meant, perhaps most significantly, that he never once mentioned Henry Beauchamp's name or reproached her for the circumstances of Eleanor's conception. For his part, Sebastian discovered that having someone care for him, genuinely care, not from duty, but from choice, healed wounds he had not realized still bled. Rosalind learned to read his silences, understood when nightmares plagued him, knew how to offer comfort without demanding explanations he could not give. She accepted his scars, both visible and not, with a matter-of-fact tenderness that slowly convinced him he might be worthy of love after all. Eleanor, meanwhile, grew into a bright, spirited child who resembled her mother in coloring and her biological father in features, though none who knew the family would have questioned Sebastian's paternity. He doted on her with shameless favoritism, carrying her about the garden on his shoulders, reading to her from inappropriate military histories, teaching her to identify birds and flowers with the thoroughness of a natural philosopher. When Rosalind conceived again, this time unquestionably Sebastian's child, some 15 months after Eleanor's birth, the joy was uncomplicated and shared. Their son, James, arrived with far less drama than his sister, a placid infant who seemed content to observe the world with Sebastian's gray-blue eyes and cause minimal disturbance. The village had long since accepted the Wycliffes as respectable, if slightly odd gentry. Captain Wycliffe's limp and scars earned respect rather than pity, the marks of a hero after all. Mrs. Wycliffe's quiet intelligence and her husband's obvious devotion made them favorites amongst the local families. If anyone noted that Eleanor had arrived somewhat precipitously after the marriage, they kept such observations to themselves. The child bore Sebastian's name, was clearly loved by both parents, and that was sufficient for all but the most determined gossips. Those determined gossips did exist, of course. There were whispers about the hasty marriage, speculation about Rosalind's past, rumors that filtered occasionally from Gloucestershire about Lieutenant Beauchamp's own rather rushed wedding. His bride delivered an air with suspicious promptness, suggesting that the gentleman's taste for seduction extended to his own betrothed. Such gossip troubled the Wycliffes not at all. They had built something real, something solid, and the opinions of narrow-minded strangers could not touch it. The true test of their transformed marriage came unexpectedly in the spring of Eleanor's 3rd year, when Sebastian received a letter from his former commanding officer requesting his presence in London for a military inquiry. It seemed certain financial irregularities had been discovered, and Sebastian's testimony was required to establish the facts. The inquiry would take several weeks, possibly months. Sebastian would need to maintain lodgings in London, attend daily sessions, navigate the complex politics of military bureaucracy. He could not possibly bring his family. The accommodations would be inadequate, the environment unsuitable for small children. He presented this information to Rosalind with visible reluctance, clearly dreading a separation he had not sought and could not avoid. Her response surprised him. She declared calmly that if Sebastian must go to London, then naturally she would accompany him. Mrs. Albright was perfectly capable of caring for the children for a few weeks. Rosalind had never seen London properly, only passed through once on her way to Thornbridge years ago, and she would very much like to experience it with her husband. Sebastian protested. The children needed her. The expense would be considerable. London during the season was crowded, chaotic, entirely inappropriate for a woman of her temperament. Rosalind simply smiled and began making arrangements. They departed for London on a bright April morning, leaving 2 tearful children in Mrs. Albright's capable hands, and arrived in the capital to find lodgings Sebastian had arranged in a respectable but unfashionable district near the Inns of Court. What followed were 6 weeks that felt, in many ways, like a delayed wedding journey. The military inquiry occupied Sebastian's days, but his evenings belonged to Rosalind. He showed her London with the pride of a native guide, not the fashionable London of balls and assemblies, but the real city. They visited the British Museum, wandered through bookshops, attended the theatre, walked in parks both grand and hidden. And it was in London, surrounded by crowds of strangers who knew nothing of their history, that Rosalind realized how completely she had fallen in love with her husband. Not the desperate, consuming passion she had mistaken for love with Henry. This was quieter, deeper, built on countless small moments of trust and care. It was the way Sebastian took her arm when crossing muddy streets, the way he listened to her opinions as though they mattered, the way he looked at her across the breakfast table each morning as though she were the finest thing in his world. She told him so one evening as they walked back to their lodgings after attending a performance of Hamlet. She said that she loved him, not from gratitude, not from obligation, but truly, deeply, with her whole heart. That marrying him was the best thing that had ever happened to her, even if it had begun in desperation. That she could not imagine her life without him now. Sebastian stopped walking, right there in the middle of the street, and stared at her as though she had performed some miracle. Then he pulled her into an embrace entirely inappropriate for a public thoroughfare and whispered into her hair that he had loved her since Thornbridge, had married her against all reason and expectation, had spent 2 years trying not to hope that she might someday feel the same. They returned to their lodgings in a state of euphoria that would have embarrassed them both had they been capable of caring about such things. The military inquiry concluded successfully. Sebastian's testimony helped exonerate an innocent man and expose the true culprit, earning him the gratitude of his former commander and a modest commendation. But more importantly, it gave him and Rosalind those 6 weeks in London, that time away from daily responsibilities, to simply be together, to cement the bond that had formed so unexpectedly. They returned to their cottage in late May to find Eleanor had grown impossibly tall in their absence, that James had learned to crawl, and that Mrs. Albright had maintained the household with effortless competence. The reunion was joyful, chaotic, filled with sticky embraces and tearful declarations, and Eleanor's endless questions about London. That evening, after the children had been settled and the household had returned to its usual rhythm, Sebastian and Rosalind stood together in their garden, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of rose and gold. Sebastian observed quietly that they had been married 3 years now, and that he considered himself the most fortunate man in England. Rosalind, leaning against his shoulder, replied that fortune had very little to do with it. He had made a choice, an extraordinary, selfless choice, and had proven through every action since that his word could be trusted. She was the fortunate one, she insisted, to have found a man who understood that real love was built not on pretty promises, but on daily acts of kindness and fidelity. They stood in comfortable silence as stars began to emerge, and if the ghosts of past mistakes haunted the gathering darkness, they had lost their power to wound. For this is the truth that society often obscures, that redemption is possible, that mistakes need not define us, that love founded on respect and steadiness can prove stronger than passion built on sand. Rosalind had been ruined by a charming scoundrel who spoke poetry and delivered pain. She had been saved by a scarred soldier who offered mercy without conditions and love without demands. And in the end, it was the quiet, steady love that triumphed, the kind that woke each morning and chose commitment anew, that weathered storms and celebrated small joys, that built families and futures not on romantic fantasy, but on honest partnership. If one were to encounter the Wycliffes today, for they remain in that village still, their family grown to include 2 more children, their happiness deepened by time, one would see nothing remarkable. Simply a country gentleman with his wife, surrounded by boisterous offspring, living the sort of ordinary life that society deems unremarkable. But the astute observer would note the way Captain Wycliffe still looks at his wife after a decade of marriage, with wonder, as though he cannot quite believe his fortune. And the way Mrs. Wycliffe's hand seeks his in moments of quiet, finding there the steady anchor she had once thought lost to her forever. They would note Eleanor, now a spirited girl of 13, who adores the father who raised her and knows nothing of the man who sired her. They would see James and his younger siblings growing up in a home where love is demonstrated rather than merely declared. And perhaps, if they were very astute indeed, they would recognize the truth, that sometimes the greatest love stories begin not with passion, but with mercy, not with romance, but with redemption, not with the man who promises everything, but with the man who delivers on what he pledges. And so another tale of hearts united reaches its blessed conclusion. Love, it seems, finds a way even through the cruelest betrayals and darkest despair. Not the shallow love of poets and seducers, but the deep, abiding love of partners who choose each other daily, who build their happiness brick by patient brick, who prove that honor and steadiness can indeed triumph over charm and pretty lies. If you have stayed with this chronicle until its end, dear listeners, perhaps you will do this author the honor of leaving your mark below. A small indication that these tales of redemption and genuine affection still matter in our often cynical world. And should you wish to hear more such stories, your continued patronage would be most gratefully received. For there are many tales yet to tell, many hearts yet to unite, and much wisdom to be gleaned from those who loved truly rather than merely passionately. Until we meet again in another story, I remain your devoted chronicler of the human heart, ever searching for truth beneath society's glittering surface.